Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the council meeting of Tuesday, the 17th of September, the last one of the triennium. Please be aware that this meeting's being live streamed and the video is available on YouTube. So members, please speak into your microphones and speak as though you are talking to the person furthest away from you in the room. Calling for any apologies. I don't believe there are any. Okay. And there is no public forum today, no chairperson's report, but to say that at the end of the meeting it will be definitely Councillor Stewart's and Councillor Brown's last meeting, so Councillor Stewart is asked to say a few words, which will be nice, and Councillor Brown if you wish to speak as well, so we'll save that till the end of the meeting. And the rest of us, it may be our last meeting. We're just unsure about that as yet. Okay, so there are any late items? I don't believe there are. Any confidential business to be transferred into the open? Okay, and going on to change of order of the business. It's probably best if we stick with this order because we're also waiting for some legal advice on the report into Mission Street. So we will just stick with where we're going. I have had a request to try and notify some interested parties when the Marine Precinct will be on. It's impossible to exactly tell it, but an hour or so before, if we get a bit of a feeling for it, we can email those people. Now, regarding the order, the minutes. We've had 2 extra sets of minutes distributed to you, but I'm not sure if you've had time to look at those, in which case I am happy to do the minutes, change the order to do the minutes a little later. To make sure. Yeah, Councillor Robson.
Your Worship, we'll still need time to read them, and obviously we're not going to read them while we're doing business, so there's going to need to be an adjournment at some point for us to read them.
Yes, so I will come back to the minutes later in the day and make sure that you've either had your morning break or your lunch break.
Thank you.
Or we'll allow specific time to do that. Any declarations of conflict of interest? Okay, so the first item is the Tauranga City Council Annual Report 2018-2019. Paul.
Good morning, Mayor and elect members. Just presenting the final 2018-19 annual report. Process this morning is that we'll present the report. Audit New Zealand will also provide an audit opinion through the course of the resolutions. In terms of the financials for the year, very consistent what you've seen through the draft document. Net debt very close to budget at 441 million. The corresponding debt revenue ratio 176%. It's been a record year in terms of capital delivery of over 200 million of capital projects delivered at 206 million. The vested asset number is lower than what we budgeted, but still at 25 million. So overall our rate surplus for the year is close to budget, a $300,000 rate surplus, which is a recommendation to transfer the balance of that to risk reserve. So apart from that, I'll take the report as read and have any questions.
Before we go to questions, so there is a correct order to do these in with a gap in the middle so that audit can speak, if I recall correctly. So your suggestion would be...
So resolutions A and B,
yeah.
And then there's an opportunity for audit to present the audit report, which is then received.
Thank you. Okay, so any questions for staff? Yes, Councillor Brown.
Thank you. I have just 2 questions, or just queries, if you like. One is we're on page 46 of our agenda with the snapshot of all of the amazing things that we've been doing. We've got passenger trips on buses there, but really that's not relative to us. It's more relative to Regional Council, and we have a lot of trouble trying to distinguish the difference between us running the service and them running the service, and who owns what and who's responsible for what. So it's a little bit, I think it's a little bit misleading to have that in there. Just a thought, so whether there's some validity to that. And my other question is on page 200 of our agenda, when we're talking about the Moau base track, the final words of the paragraph on the left says, generally if an area has slipped before slip again, and as a result, we have to realign the track. but we might not have to realign the track, and it just looks a bit like predetermination. So I'm wondering if we could choose the word may instead of have to, because we don't know what the end solution is going to be for the repair of the track.
Through the chair, yes, we'll change that report. In terms of the passenger trips on buses, we can either leave the statistic in there and just be clear that that service is delivered through regional council, or remove it. Okay.
Yes, I think making that clear would be good. It probably won't make a lot of difference. People still believe it's us, but I think it needs to be stated clearly. Any other points people would like to make? Yeah, Councillor Robson.
On page 144, and what happened in 2018-19, there is reference to the Durham Street upgrade project. I'm somewhat disheartened that that project can be placed in an annual report and no reference be made to the issues surrounding it. I don't need to remind this council that the last annual report I voted against for the simple reason is that it did not give...
Point of order, Mr. Chairman.
There's a question coming.
Look, I think he's already launched into a subject that he can raise in the debate when we move the motion. I would like to hear a question very quickly.
Sure, there's a question about to come. I think I can probably work that out. Yep, Councillor Robson.
Thank you. Your prescience is appreciated. I wish it was shared by all around the table. I made the point very clearly in the last annual report by voting against it, that a report must reflect accurately to our community the events of the preceding year, good and bad. We had a workshop in this very room where the issues around balance in the annual report were raised explicitly with staff. So what I'm asking is, why am I reading what I'm reading in the second bullet point under what happened in 2018 and 19, and do staff genuinely believe that gives an accurate reflection of that project?
Through the chair, page 147 actually displays the challenges that were occurred throughout that project and the learnings that were taken forward to the following year.
Okay, that's fine, but I just wonder if a few words could be placed just to, because we did sort of
Supplementary-
agree to a warts and all approach.
Supplementary observation, Your Worship, we have had, again in the last annual report, where we buried the Bella Vista numbers. The press needed help to find them. They were there, but they were buried in notes. It's just the case of people will read things superficially. They read the front of things, often executive summaries, but not detail. There's no reason why the supplementary information over the page could not be referenced in this point.
Through the chair, we'll make that reference.
That's fine. Now, the other questions? Okay, so we'd need to look at A and B, and then to hear from the auditors, so we'll just find the appropriate page. So I'm prepared to move that we receive and approve the annual report, and it's seconded by Councillor Clout. And speaking to that, I'm glad that particular point was raised by Councillor Robson, because we are trying to be more clearer about any problems that we have, as well as the successes, in order to get a balance. I think we've got that. We've had a number of workshops and meeting on it. Probably will never be going to be perfect, but I think we've reached a stage where we can approve it and receive it, and look forward to going forward. Any other speakers? Councillor Clout.
Thank you. Just a big thank you to the staff who've put countless hours into this annual report, and also to elected members for going through in quite some detail and suggesting some changes and getting the balance right. Thank you.
Yeah, there have been some significant improvements in this report. It does come through the Finance, Audit and Risk Committee, obviously, of which I'm chair. There have been some significant improvements in this report, I believe, from the report last year, and I appreciate the effort made to produce those. I think one of the ones that's quite important for our community to see is actually on page 64 of our agenda, where we get a more detailed breakdown of debt funding. The debt of a council is always a topic of some political import, even more so in years like this. So the work by staff to break out those numbers and show how much debt is actually being borne effectively, directly by the ratepayer, I think is valuable to inform discussions that are happening at the moment. And I think that's an example of the sort of level of detail we need to provide our community so they can in fact have informed discussions. Thank you.
Yeah, certainly support this, and also just wanted to say thank you to our staff for the summary, the annual report summary that's also in the report, which we haven't looked at in detail today, but most of us, well, we have read it. So if you don't want to read a 353-page annual report, you can read a 35-page summary, which is a much easier read for most people.
Other speakers? Okay, so I'll put A and B. All in favour say aye. Aye. Against? Okay, I think that's an aye, but just a time delay. Okay, so that is carried. Thank you, Clarence and Anton.
Good morning, Your Worship and councillors. I think I'll start off with, excuse me, just thanking Paul, Catherine, Marin, and the rest of the team for how well prepared they were for this audit. I don't know if you can remember, but last year we only adopted on the 27th of October, which is pretty much a month later. So they were really well prepared for this audit. I also want to thank Councillor Robson and the Finance and Audit Risk Committee for their input during the course of this audit, making sure that we've got the disclosures and everything to a level that everybody felt comfortable with. So I'm very pleased to present to you today my two unmodified audit opinions. The one will be on the full annual report, and the other one will be on the summary annual report. It's also not on council alone, but on the group, and the group consists of council, Bay Venues Limited, Tauranga Art Gallery, and then also some of your other equity accounted investees. Council, you are responsible for the preparation of this annual report, and then as an auditor, I'm responsible to issue an independent auditor's report on this. So I think you've all received a copy of my audit opinions. So the summary audit opinion refers to the full audit opinion, which pretty much just says it's a summary of the full annual report. The full audit opinion requires me to express your opinion to see if you have complied with the requirements of Schedule 10 of the Act, and also the completeness and accuracy of disclosures about your performance against benchmarks based on the Local Government Financial Reporting and Prudence Regulations 2014. So my opinion states that the financial statements presents fairly in all material respects: the financial position, the financial performance, the cash flows. So we say that that's all fairly presented. Then you also comply with generally accepted accounting practice here in New Zealand, and that your funding impact statements presents fairly the amount of funds produced and the sources of funding, and also how those funds were spent compared to what you actually consulted with your community, and if there's any significant variances, how that variance has been explained. So that is also in your groups of activities, that's in all the transport and all of that. So we look at your levels of service that you promised and the actual delivery of that and the reporting of that. So if there's any variances, we look at the variance explanations to make sure that that is quite clear if there's any big variances. We also look at some of the other information. So with the other information that's excluded from our audit opinion, we make sure that there's no inaccuracies and that it's materially in line with our expectations. Normally, we would be expected to report on any material misstatements. There's nothing that we have to report, so that's a clear opinion, which is really good. And then other matters that we've identified as things like your provisions for known liabilities. We made sure that that is all accounted for correctly and disclosed correctly. things like your contingent liabilities and then related party disclosures. All of those things are incorporated in the annual report, and we're happy how that was disclosed. We also looked at your information technology control environment. We made sure that your general IT control environment have been assessed as design and operational effective. And overall, we consider that you have the processes and controls in place to manage the risk in these key areas. Looking forward, we will issue an opinion on your debenture trust deed and the compliance with that. That will be within 30 days of this report. By the end of October, we will issue that report. And now, that is all that I want to say. Anton will just cover off some of the specific issues that we've covered off during the course of our audit, and then if there's any questions afterwards, we'll take any of those.
Good morning, Your Worship and councillors. Some of the key issues in our audit that we covered was the revaluation and fair value assessment of property, plant and equipment. Council, as discussed in the Finance, Audit and Risk Committee in August, revalued a large number of infrastructure assets, being water, supply, stormwater, wastewater, roading and marine assets as at 1 July 2018. We confirmed the accounting treatment and disclosure relating to the revaluation was reasonable and fairly stated in the financial statements. The council then also completed a fair value assessment on the property, all other property, plant and equipment, including those revalued at 1st of July as at 30th June 2019, to ensure that the fair value of those assets weren't materially different from the carrying amount. The carrying amount is the value that's disclosed in the financials. Bay Venues Limited also completed a fair value assessment on its property, plant and equipment. The component auditor also reviewed those fair value assessments and confirmed that the fair value of those assets are also materially not different from the carrying amount. So, but on that, we were satisfied that both council and group numbers for property, plant and equipment were fairly stated. We also looked at the recognition and treatment of building-related claims. That is, we reviewed the provision and contingent liabilities relating to weather tightness claims. As you will note, there's a significant increase in both provision and settlement of about 9 and 2.4 million respectively, and also the contingent liability increased about 16.7 million. And this is primarily due to several multi-unit claims now in progress. We also reviewed the disclosures provided in the financial statements and considered the treatment and valuation methodology applied has been correctly stated and freely reflected. There was this year also additional disclosures included around Bella Vista. We reviewed those disclosures and confirmed that those were appropriate. This year, the council obtained a funding facility from the Housing Infrastructure Fund for growth projects relating to the Wairiri water plant and the Taumanga wastewater treatment plant. The Wairiri received a facility of just under 106 million, and the Taumanga wastewater plant was 51.8 million. We confirmed that as at 30th of June, the drawdown has been made of 8.3 million for these projects. We reviewed the disclosures provided for this facility in the financial statements and considered that the treatment and valuation methodology applied is appropriate. We also look at management override. There's an inherent risk in every organization of fraud resulting from management override of internal controls. Some of the procedures we overtook to confirm that there was no issues is we tested the appropriateness of journal entries recorded in the general ledger and other adjustments made in the preparation of the annual report and financial statements. We also reviewed accounting estimates for bias and evaluated whether circumstances producing the bias, if any, present a risk or material statement. We also reviewed if there were any significant transactions outside the normal course of business, or that it otherwise would appear unusual, to determine whether the transactions suggest that they may have been entered into to engage in any fraudulent financial reporting or to conceal misappropriation of assets. We are satisfied that the risk around management override of controls were appropriately considered and that there's nothing to report. Also, Council has a large investments in its subsidiary. The Council performed an impairment assessment over its subsidiaries and concluded that there was no impairment in these subsidiaries. We reviewed that impairment and concurred with Council's assessment. There's some other matters that we looked at, like the reporting of service performance. We completed a review of some key measures, and we are happy that there's no significant issues that need to be brought to your attention. There are also other matters and sector-wide matters that we looked into that are of interest to local authorities in common. However, these, due to time that we have in the meeting, these will be reported in our management report to governors and would be discussed in the future. And again, we'd just like to thank Paul, Catherine and Marin and the rest of their team for the assistance in the audit. And if there are any questions, we are available to take them.
It's a process question on next steps in our report, and I'm just getting confused with the date that you mentioned before. In our report number 8, it says next step is that it will be publicly available 23rd of November 2018. Well, obviously it's 19, but as a month from, is it from today, or is it a month from when we receive the report? So it's in our report, so we need to get the right date in the council report.
It is within 30 days, so whenever it's ready, we will issue that report, as long as within the 30 days from this, from today's date.
Anton, you raised the topic of management override. There's been in the public domain some discussion in relation to that concept in the context of the Colgan report. This, I believe, has been commented on publicly. When you analyse or look for issues around management override, can you give us some idea of whether that's largely around financial transactions or whether it relates to broader process issues, just to give us some feel, because that issue wasn't picked up previous year, and so I'm just trying to get a feel for, because people place a lot of reliance on audit, and sometimes I believe they don't understand the constraints and the limits that audit goes to, so I just wanted to get that out if we could.
Thank you for that. Obviously, our focus is on the financial side of it, so our main focus will be on the financial side. In terms of the non-financials, we do have a look at the systems and controls around some of the key measures, but obviously, if you look at your non-financial measures, there's, I think, well over 100 of them. So we don't look at all of them from a time and cost perspective.
Thank you.
Thank you, Clarence and Anton. So I'm happy to move D, E, F and G. If there's a seconded Councillor Robson. I think it's all been said. I would once again like to thank staff and obviously the audit team as well for their work, and open the floor to any other questions. Councillor Robson. Oh, sorry, discussion.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to support the motion, but I think it's really important that people understand the limits that an auditor faces in terms of the time and resource they have available and how far into an organisation they can go. And in that respect, it behoves councillors to understand their, if you like, complementary role in relation to ensuring that the organisation performs as it should. That every day we come across situations which, if we have a question, we should raise. There was an interesting piece in the latest NBR, for those of you who take an interest in governance, around the need to have people on governance who dig and ask questions. And I think in the context of audit, we just need to remember that, you know, that famous phrase, remember Enron passed every audit. It should be reminded regularly. So I thank the audit team for their work, happy to support this, but just like us to remember that caveat.
Other speakers? Okay, so Yes, councillor Stewart.
Mayor Brownless, just checking, did you receive C in your... Did you move C?
Has seconded it. So in that case, I'll put it all in favour, say aye. Aye. Against? Okay. So that's carried. Thank you very much. Right. Now, we will just have a 10-minute adjournment so we can get this latest piece of advice to you. So just a 10-minute break and then we'll be commencing again. You can choose to read minutes or have a stretch. and it's DC 291, 11 Mission Street Supplementary Report. And Christine is going to speak to this, and I think has some further information.
So through the chairs, the supplementary report covers additional information that was discussed with elected members subsequent to the meeting. I think the key points are summarised in terms of the resolution that was passed by the Elms Foundation, and a copy of that is attached, noted in paragraph 6 of the report, where their primary position is that the Mission Street was to be transferred to the Elms. And then also in paragraph 9, the confirmation of the position of the Elms, which is that the Elms does not wish to influence Council's decision-making process, and that the Elms is neutral in terms of Council's decision and wish to remain silent on the matter. And I think there has been some confusion in, some have the view that it must be one or the other. The Elms either has a primary position that the 11 Mission Street should go to them, or they're neutral, but in fact they are both. So while their position is, the primary position is the property should go to the Elms, they in no way wish to influence the council decision-making process, and they wanted to very clearly remain neutral in that decision, and that's what is reflected in the report. The information in terms of the resolution, while was not included in the deliberations report, it had previously been provided to council, and it was covered in the meeting which the elected members held with members of the Elms Foundation, and is covered in the notes of that meeting, which were distributed in September 2018. In preparation for this meeting, we have sought some legal advice, given that council has already passed a resolution on the 10th of September on this matter. That legal advice is that council can supplement the resolution that has been already passed, but should not revoke or alter it. So it would be for council to take into account the letter that's received from the Elms and make a decision on whether or not you wish to supplement the resolution that's been already passed. So that's the letter dated yesterday. That letter has been tabled in this meeting and has been provided to the media, as I understand. So,
Just got one question then, Councillor Stewart. What does supplement a resolution mean?
Supplementary resolution is if you wish to take into account additional information and not directly revoke, but if that information is such that you wish to make a further decision, you can do so. And I think if you come up with some wording, so we've just had a teleconference with our legal advisor, Mari, and I can give advice as to whether that wording would meet the definition of supplement. We've talked that through with our advisor.
Does supplement go as far as making a different decision?
Do, depending on the wording of the resolution. As I say, if a motion were to be moved, there were a number of us in the room on that teleconference will be able to look at the wording of the resolution and give you some advice of what would meet the requirements or how it could be reworded to meet the requirements of the standing orders.
Councillor Stewart and Kurak.
Thank you, through the chair. Given that elected members didn't have the full information in our agenda last time, surely that would nullify the decision made based on the fact that there wasn't full and accurate information on the day. Was that something that was asked?
Through the chair, no, it wasn't something that was asked, but that information was available and has been previously recorded in council minutes and in the hearings process. So it's not as though the information hadn't been made available to elected members.
Christine, when you say the legals would be happy if some content was added to supplement the previous resolution and it would meet requirements, what exactly do they mean by requirements, and what requirements are they referring to, please?
So in the standing orders there are provisions in terms of the notice required for revocation or an alteration of a previous decision. So standing orders 23.6 requires the chief executive to have, or a chair to put a report clearly notifying a revocation or amendment or alteration. the report that's on the agenda is a receive-only recommendation, so it doesn't include a revocation recommendation, and so that notice was not given through the agenda topic. So the advice is that you can't then pass a revocation, but you could pass an alteration decision, a supplementary decision, sorry.
Thank you. I haven't read my emails. Has this this advice been forwarded to us?
Most of it was verbal on those matters, and we've just received it when we took that break, so during the adjournment.
So you can flick that to us now?
No, it was a verbal phone call.
Just 5 minutes ago.
So that's why we adjourned the meeting, because we were waiting on that final advice, because the letter from the Elms wasn't received till late yesterday, and that's been provided to our legal advisors, and they've given us that verbal advice. We have some earlier advice in writing, but it doesn't cover that particular matter.
Okay. So when is it likely that DCC will be in receipt of some written advice?
Possibly by midday, so the person who was giving us the advice has come out of a meeting to give it to us over the phone and has gone back into the meeting. So we could seek for that to be translated into writing and have that available to you later in the day if you wished. As I said, we have some earlier advice, but it didn't address all the questions, so we went back and sought some further information. So we have an early draft, but it doesn't deal with the supplementary information.
And the early draft, which I assume is in writing, is available? Yep. Well, thank you.
Robson?
I'd like to move, Your Worship, that this matter lay on the table till later in the meeting, by which time hopefully we're in receipt of copies of the written advice already available to staff and the written version of the verbal advice that's been given to staff, so we can consider this matter obviously properly, because we don't want to repeat what we did last week in good faith.
Okay, is there a second for that?
I'll second that.
Seconded for that. There's no discussion on that. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Against? Okay, I think that's an aye. So it will lie on the table until we receive that advice. So carrying on with the rest of the meeting. Now, I've got to try and cater for the wishes of those wishing to come for the Marine Precinct discussion. So I suggest we notify them now if they want to, that it's probably likely to be within the next half an hour or so. And we can continue on with the next agenda item, which is the endorsement of alternate controllers for the Western Bay Emergency Management Operating Area. And yes,
Just a point of clarification, just because there's quite a few people here wanting to know what the next steps are for the 11 Mission Street discussion, are we able to give a time, say 1 or 1:30, to be safe, so that if they wanted to return, they can? There's a lot of people waiting
I think
here.
we'll say 1. It won't be earlier than 1, but it may be later than 1. That's the thing. So we can continue. We can deal with our confidential agenda as well, so that we because we need to keep. We have a lot of things on the items today to discuss, but so we can look at 1 o'clock. Yeah, Councillor Baldock.
Just before everybody leaves, I just wonder if you could make it clear again why we are deferring right now, just so everyone understands the process.
So the reason we're deferring is that we have some legal advice that we need to actually get in writing. It's verbal at the moment, and so that council makes a decision that is right and within what we can make, then we need to have that in front of us. So we'll adjourn till 1 o'clock for that. Sorry, we'll defer that matter till 1 o'clock. Thanks. Yeah. People are welcome to sit here for the time if they like, or just as you wish. Yep. Okay, so we'll go on to... Yes, Councillor Kurak.
But meantime, if elected members could get the other written advice from the lawyers covering other issues, please. Thank you.
That will be done.
It could, just for the assistance of the process and time, perhaps those who have a mind to be moving something other than simply the receipt of the report, which I will certainly be doing at 1 o'clock, maybe they can work on their wording so that the legal opinions can be balanced against what actually is being proposed. Otherwise, we're just kicking things around.
Point taken. Okay, DC 287. Okay, and just Councillor Mason can't quite hear, so if we could speak up a little. So, DC 287, endorsement of alternate controller, and you're going to speak to that, Gareth.
Just through the chair, I'll table the report as read. At the moment, we only have one local controller, which is Paul Davidson. Our new manager, emergency management, Rowan Wallace, has started. He is a trained controller. It makes sense in the short term to have a bit of depth of coverage, so we'd just like to appoint him into that role. In the long term, I think he'll probably stand down from that role because he has a broader role to play as an advisor as opposed to getting into the business. But in the short term, we may as well have the cover.
Fight to second, but we'll give it to Councillor Brown. And would you like to speak to it?
The recommendation.
Yeah, I'm just noting that he is, and it does say in the report from the leader from Civil Defence that he's an accredited CDEM controller, which is great to have on board, and you can never have too many knowledgeable people when there's a crisis, which hopefully we won't have.
Okay, any other speakers? So I'll put that all in favour, say aye. Aye. Against? And that's carried. Okay, we have people coming in just as we speak for the Marine Precinct discussion, so we will just go on to the Transport and Urban Form update, which is DC 288. True 273, sorry. Okay, Nick is not here for that one, so if we could go on to the one that I just suggested, and we will come back to Tauranga Transport. So the Transport and Urban Form update, are we all right for that? Thank you. DC 288.
So in the absence of another Urban Form and Transport Development Committee, we thought it was appropriate to bring this report to you. It just gives you an update on some significant developments since that last committee meeting. There has been a number of national policy statements. I think we flagged for you at the last meeting of the Urban Form and Transport Development that we expected them to come. 3 of them have now been issued: highly productive land, urban development and freshwater management. They will all have impacts on us in terms of growth planning for our city. The highly productive land in particular will have potential impacts on locations of future greenfield areas in the sub-region. The urban development one will have a significant impact in terms of residential intensification and urban density and form. And freshwater management has the potential to also impact greenfield areas in terms of preservation of natural and ecological environments. So given the timing of these, those submissions are due in or around the timing of the election. Our intention is to informally link with elected members. We'll circulate to you sort of the key points that we expect to make in terms of those submissions. They are predominantly technical and strategic in nature, not political. So we'll circulate that for any informal comments, but we'll need to lodge our formal submissions without a council resolution to support.
Questions, Councillor Baldock?
And this DC 288 also formally receives the accessible properties as well, is it?
Yep.
Or is it?
Yep, so this report does 3 things. It covers the national policy statements, it covers the Urban Form and Transport Initiative Foundation report, which was presented to the August Smart Growth Leadership Group meeting, so is put on this formal agenda to be formally received by TCC. And thirdly, it includes the Accessible Properties Vision document. So Accessible Properties owns a number of homes in the Gate Park Tauranga South area, which is the key location for our Te Papa Peninsula Spatial Plan Intensification Corridor, and we are actively working together with Accessible Properties on that matter, so I thought it was appropriate to include this in your agenda so you can see what's happening there. and give you a level of confidence that the staff are actively working with accessible properties through our spatial plan project.
Have you got another question, or
I'm happy to move when questions
when the
are
time
finished.
comes? So, Councillor Robson.
Yeah, I note the ever-changing order of transport and urban form. So I don't know whether we're talking about AFTI or TUFI at the moment, but I suppose I just want a question around the comments made by Christine Jones with regard to strategic and technical, not political. Anything strategic with the city, in my view, is obviously highly political. I feel there would be value in, because not everyone's a member of Smart Growth or fully participates in Smart Growth, I feel there would be value in some sort of workshop, or perhaps not obviously for the current, how can one put it, cacophony of councillors, but early in the next triennium, so the question is there anything planned to workshop the new council into space and place on this? Because there are significant political issues around this, and we need to make sure that, if you like, in the interregnum, the process doesn't get too far ahead of the politicians. It never ends well.
So, through Chair, sorry, it probably was not well phrased. What I meant is there's sort of no new political issues, so the matters that you've already given us strategic direction on, so not something where you haven't given us a view or you haven't given us clarity about the direction you want to head. It's things like residential intensification and the mix between Brown and Greenfield. So I absolutely agree, they're political matters, but we think we've got enough of a political direction from you that we understand where you want to go, and we won't be going off in a different direction from what you've given us. And so that addresses the first question. In respect to the second, yes, absolutely. So we are starting to work on what we're describing as the induction process for the incoming council. There is a internal workshop on the 30th of September for us to think about how that would all fit together, and urban form, network planning, infrastructure planning, and the national environment and context are key elements of that induction process.
Appreciate that. That will be I assume that's almost a full day, given the size of those issues and our community's interest in transport.
There will be a number of days on different topics, and we're just working through how we get that balance right, so not to overwhelm new elected members, but to provide a good base of information.
Thank you.
My question is, Christine, we know the government's policy statement on urban development. It's given direction about intensification and things like that. When can we expect from them how, and whether the normal processes will be followed, whether the government will intervene to just simply direct us, whether they will keep the environment court in and out of it, will they be public consultation? When will we know how that will work?
I think there's a couple of processes here. The national policy statement will set the overall policy direction and strategic direction and intent. And then there are a couple of other processes underway. So there is the review of the Resource Management Act, and we haven't got a clear timeline for that, and that will affect some of the individual processes. And then there is the newly formed Kāinga Ora entity, which may well, in subsequent legislative changes, receive what have been described as Urban Development Authority powers, where it could potentially step in certain circumstances to lead plan changes and progress urban development. That's not clear yet, and so when those bills become drafted for the subsequent stages of the structure and the powers that authority might have, we will, as usual, come to you and talk to you about that. So we are working with the staff at MFE and MHUD, Ministry for Housing and Urban Development, and we're also talking to them about the timing of the implementation of the National Policy Statement for Urban Development and how that may align or not align with our proposed plan changes that we're talking about in early 2020. So if we'll have to come to Council in the new year and talk about the timing when you want to go notify those plan changes, and whether there is any logical knot in potentially deferring it until the National Policy Statement on Urban Development becomes effective, and that will depend on how MFE are progressing. So because that will give more weight to the Council's plan changes, because you'll have a National Policy Statement supporting it. So we will provide advice at the time. It's not something that MFE had considered to date. We've raised that with them and they're now taking that into account and thinking about what that means in terms of the timeline, but also about whether any transitional provisions need to be included in the national policy statement for plan changes that are already underway. So they are considering that point that we've raised with them, which deals with part of your question. So we'll once we've got further clarity on all of those matters, that will come back to a report to the council in early 2020.
And then Councillor Baldock, I think, is going to move.
Through the chair to Christine, you know, the UFTI and our Tauranga Transport Systems Network Plan, which comes first? I mean, does that feed into UFTI, or because that Tauranga Transport System Network Plan, there's some pretty important strategic planning there, I would imagine. So how do those two work together, and the timing?
Perhaps cover that under DC 273 rather than under DC 288. So happy to answer the question, but it more appropriately fits with the other report.
And that report's just prior to this. We went in a different order. So, yeah, that's fine. Councillor Baldock. Yeah.
Happy to move, Your Worship, receive of the report DC 288.
Seconded by Councillor Robson, speaking to it.
Yeah, I think the comment made by Councillor Robson earlier is important, and it's good to know staff are already thinking about induction for a new council, because you know, there's some pretty weighty and important things that people will have to get their heads around. I don't know about it being a full day. I think it's probably a full 3 years, because we you know, we are living in a state of flux. The legislative changes that are not finalised, that we know are coming down the pipeline, make all of this rather complex, and we just have to keep adapting to what government policy statements come out, what legislation comes out, and doing the best we can to meet the needs of a growing city and our community through transport and urban form. I think the UFTI draft foundation report went through some iterations, and I think it's now in a pretty good place. And it's a good document, I think, for people who wish to delve into and see what the breadth of this is. You know, it can be very informative. I am disappointed, I must say, that on the front page of it, somehow we've slipped in a light rail or tram, which wasn't in any of the pictures before. And I think we've already had a lot of discussion about this, that really our future of public transport, at least in the next 20 to 30 years, is focused on an effective public transport system based on buses. The idea of rail or trams and so on are very, very expensive commodities, and are not workable for a city that has a population of less. Even after 30, 50 years of growth, we'll have a population of less than 250,000 people. So I'm sorry, I am disappointed about those graphics, because they sometimes convey something. We remember some other graphics that were widely circulated around the city with some pretty lavish schemes of monorails and you name it. And I think we start off wrong when we start giving people that impression. However, generally the report is in a good place. The second report, the Pukehinahina project from Accessible Properties, is very exciting. Very exciting for me as a boy from Gate Pa, as you can understand. But this is the kind of partnership we need in order to deliver on residential change, the intensification we want to see down the Te Papa Peninsula. I have no doubt that this creating a place to belong and thrive, a partnership vision for housing and community revitalisation in Gate Pa and Tauranga South will play a really important part in what we do in achieving our goals of intensification and so on, and growth within our existing areas, but also just an amazing change of the whole community. You see it beginning on the corner of 20th Ave now. When it's spread right through Gate Pa with the properties they own, I think people are going to enjoy a better standard of living, a better amenity in their communities, and I certainly welcome that and support what Accessible Properties are seeking out to achieve.
Seconder.
I thought Larry, Your Worship, was just about to, Councillor Baldock was just about to exceed his speech in terms of depth and veracity and facts and urging the speech he gave last week. But I agree with a lot of what he said. I think a couple of points that I'd like noted from our own report is the role that central government has. We open the report by saying significant developments, and the first thing we talk about are draft national policy statements from central government. And in this time, this triennial event, it's really important that people understand how little freedom councils have to determine their future, and how much weight and constraint and impost and cost central government imposes on councils, without, of course, the accompanying resources. So that's point one. Point two, I totally endorse Councillor Baldock's observation about people using pictures to communicate things that aren't supported by evidence. We must stop that. It seems to be almost a contagion that people who don't have the evidence for what it is they desire seek to influence the discussion by some other means. It's not appropriate. The people running AFTI should know better. One of them actually produced a very detailed report on public transport, which actually made the very point that Councillor Baldock raises, that the short, medium-term future for public transport in this city is highly likely, on the basis of the evidence, to focus on buses. Unfortunately for this city, the buses aren't operated by the city council, but that's another matter completely. I commend the two reports. I think the Pukehina report doesn't just, if you like, inspire a boy from Gate Pa, but it would also inspire a boy from Gonville, because somehow we've got to find a better way of using resources and providing accommodation for people than the way we do currently, which results in millions of dollars being spent weekly putting people in motels. I mean, that's an abomination. But I note that that's central government's responsibility. So, receiving the reports, absolutely, I have issues with both of them at some level, but generally speaking, they are great documents to start conversations and to inform debate, and I would urge the media to read them and make the point to the community that I've made around public transport and about how much freedom local government has. It's very easy to lay things at local government's responsibility when we are but small players in that space.
Small players we are, and it reminded me of the discussion around the clearways along Cameron Road. We had some data which showed that the clearway would actually provide very little in terms of travel time advantage for the buses. And the response was, well, you know, Wellington requires us to put in place such provisions, and so that's the problem. Quite often we're strangled in terms of what we can deliver to, as Councillor Baldock said, to meet the needs of our growing community. Some of those requirements coming out of Wellington certainly chuck a spanner in the works when we look at some of the things that this council wants to achieve, but we've got to play the game, and these documents go a long way towards playing that game, and hopefully it leads us to a good place. But at the end of the day, meeting the needs of the growing community isn't going to meet the needs of everybody in terms of housing typology, transport options, because we are basically trying to lead the community into a different place, and sometimes that will create pain. But it's pain that's being dictated, potential pain being dictated by Wellington, and I'm assuming that they know best. You know, they're elected into power, and all good things will come out of that. I wish.
Thank you. I'm pleased to see the light rail picture in here, because my understanding is it's about planning into the future and looking at, I believe, 50 years into the future. I think there's an opportunity to look into the O-Bound, which runs in Adelaide, a bus which can run on rails. So I don't know what work's been done on that, but I believe there is potential in the future. Councillor Robson is quite correct in his comments about just how much is in here and how much it is connected with smart growth. There's a lot, it's quite a meaty document, and the new council will need to spend, I would suggest, many days or weeks to understand about smart growth. As Councillor Robson pointed out, not all elected members are on smart growth. I think with housing, choice is crucial going forward. And with intensification, unfortunately, I don't believe it will create affordable housing. And you need to only look at Hobsonville to see that low-cost housing does not exist in my mind anyway, having visited there. There's a typo on page 501, paragraph 13, if the committee secretary would like to pass that on. The word different. So moving forward, yes, the new council will have to spend a lot of time to understand what smart growth is all about and get their head around all the planning going forward.
Thank you. I definitely commend both reports to the public and to the press. I'm particularly interested in the accessible properties report and page 5 of their proposal report, page 561 of our agenda. And in the top right-hand corner, we read that we know the proportion of social housing provided in Tauranga is half the national average, so 2.5% compared to 4.5% nationally. So I think this is really the point we need to continue to hammer home to central government, is that, you know, we are the poor cousin when it comes to social housing in Tauranga, compared to the view largely that Tauranga is a very affluent city. And so at every opportunity, I believe we need to continue to press central government to increase the provision of social housing, and accessible properties is obviously a key aspect of that within our city. Thank you.
Any other speakers? Otherwise, we'll go to right of reply. Right of reply, Councillor Walder.
Thank you. Just a couple of quick comments. Hobsonville delivered affordable housing within the Auckland market. If you looked at the prices of theirs and compared it with the average Auckland price, it was delivering something that was affordable and was giving people an opportunity to get into the property market. So I think we have to be careful what we make comparisons with. Secondly, I do support the idea of the bus on rail trains, which we've talked about, you know, all this triennium. It was actually, some pictures of it were sent to us by Mark Dean from Western Bay, if you recall. Unfortunately, Kiwi Rail have a 2-year safety audit process for it. But I think it could offer something through this corridor, possibly. But I just remind Councillor Stewart that the population of Adelaide is 1.345 million people, and that is, you know, that is far, far away from what we will grow to within 50 years. So when we make comparisons with overseas cities, we do need to keep the population stats. Councillor Clout's comments on social housing, I agree with. And look, what we see there on the corner of 20th Ave is one old state house gone, and I believe it's 4 apartments in its place. That's the kind of multiplication of social housing, because this is not a developer flogging that off and making money. This is accessible properties under a requirement of their contract of purchase of that 1,148 properties through the Gate Park area to actually maintain social housing, multiply it, and I think that's what we're going to see. It's probably one of the best ways we're going to see a multiplication of social housing is through a project like this.
Of information, Your Worship, just sort of put some facts into the affordable housing discussion. Hobsonville Point currently advertising apartments for around $550,000. If that's affordable, I live in South Auckland.
And I think that point's been well made.
I think there must be another right of reply, surely.
Yes,
The average property price in Auckland, the point I was making, is $1 million. So if you can buy something for $500,000 in that market, there is an affordability about it. Can a Tauranga person go up there on their income? No. That is the point I was making.
okay, so I'll put that, all in favour say aye. Aye. Against? So that's carried. So we're just DC 273 transport and then we're on the marine precinct.
Thank you, Your Worship. It's my pleasure to introduce this report, and I'll shortly hand over to Christine and Nick to speak to it, assisted by their staff. But essentially, this report identifies the need for Tauranga City Council to supplement and support the work of AFTI by developing a transport strategic network plan, TSNP. It's a piece of work that when we first started AFTI, we envisaged would be conducted and delivered through the AFTI program. As things have developed, we've realised that we needed to bring this piece of work forward and to support and implement this through the AFTI program. Christine will talk a wee bit further to it, but it will require significant resource and commitment, particularly if we want to meet the time frame of AFTI and the work that that project will do with its interface with central government. Secondly, the other portion of this report talks to a review of our transport activity within Tauranga City Council as an organisation, and looking at the capability and capacity, the depth, the skills, the experience, and our ability not only to continue to develop the services, but also to implement any initiatives that may come out of the TSNP. So I'm pleased to hand over to Christine and Nick, who wish to speak to their parts of the report.
Okay, so just picking up on from Marty. So in July, this council passed a resolution in respect of the Totara Hull Hewletts network area, asking us to come back with how we were going to address long-term design solutions. And at the same time, as Marty has referred to, we were having a conversation with elected members around AFTI and whether it would deliver sufficiently on our needs to flow into the upcoming LTP and RLTP processes. So this Tauranga System Network Plan is seeking to supplement the AFTI project. It's going to move down to a key places and corridor level and look across parts of the network and identify what are the potential solutions, and move it towards a single stage business case so that we can then proceed to funding and then proceed to implementation. Our view is that the Tauranga System Network Plan will put tension on AFTI and AFTI will put tension on the Tauranga System Network Plan, so that we will have a conversation about aspirationally through AFTI what are our desires for our sub-region in terms of both urban form and transport, and the Tauranga System Network Plan will be looking at whether and how feasible and what needs to happen for that to be able to be applied and actually occur at a project level. So they will work together in tandem and be talking to each other as they move forward. Our proposal is that we would look at the Tauranga System Network Plan as an overall network, and then within that look at specific geographic areas and what we're describing as tranches. And paragraph 15 identifies what we're thinking of in terms of those tranches. So one area would be that Hewletts Road sub-area that we've talked about already, being Hewletts, Manganui, Hull and Totara. Another one being the Turret 15th Ave part of our network. The eastern area, which is the Bay Fair, Bay Park type linkage, the State Highway 2 and 29 connections, and then also the route from Barks Corner to Bay Park is sort of what we've looked at. Our cost estimates, you'll see there we're asking for up to $3 million. So that's been based on just the learnings that we've had from the Tauriko West work that we've been doing. Taken those sort of early ballpark numbers and said if for each of these geographic areas that was a similar cost, how would that stack up? We are approaching NZTA for subsidy funding. Those discussions are still underway, so we can't confirm yet whether that'll be available. So we're saying up to $3 million. If we're able to achieve a subsidy, that would reduce that. Attached to the report in the appendix is the detailed project brief. It's not actually a project plan at this stage. There's still further work to do. Alistair Talbot is the project manager and will be able to speak to any specific questions. But I just draw your attention to the diagram on page 481, which is a key diagram which shows how UFTI and the Tauranga System Network Plan fit together under the NZTA business case model. And it's really important because if we are going to receive any NZTA subsidy or apply for any Crown grant from a package of projects under the UFTI and the TSN plan, we're going to have to demonstrate compliance with the business case model. So the UFTI will deal with the strategic case and the program business case, and then the Tauranga System Network Plan would move into the single stage business case, and the detailed business case would be picked up through this process. And by running those in parallel and working together, we should be in a position much earlier to flow projects into the LTP and the RLTP and move forward with actually implementing them and getting them off the ground, rather than waiting for the UFTI project to complete itself before we start the TSNP. So I don't know if you want to work on this, or if Nick, and then can ask Alistair if and Martin if they want to add anything.
Morena tata. I like to think about this paper in two parts. One is the what we need to deliver, and that's what's being delivered through the TSNP, and the next part is the how. So how do we, as an organisation, organise ourselves with capability and capacity to deliver on what will undoubtedly be an increasing demand. It is about being proactive and have the planning, engagement and delivery skills and the capacity to deliver on the network plan. And I think the story about how we need to organise ourselves need to be forward-looking, but there is a story already written about this that we need to consider, and that's in the many reviews that have been done in the transport space over the last year or so, many of which you have commissioned. So that's the Peterson, Hanna and Smith reviews. So they've been taken into consideration when we have looked at how we can better organise ourselves. And in the report, we break it into three components. One is the capability and capacity component, which this paper or endorsement is predominantly about. Then we have highlighted some other issues as well that are needed to be attended to for us to deliver better in the transport space. And the second one is integration between groups, between the transport planning, project management, and the transport group, then to operate and operate the network. We come from a history of Baton-style handover from transport planning to PMO, and then over to the operators of the network. And there's been a place for that, and I think the issues we're dealing with now demand for us to do something different. I think that's can be clearly stated. So that brings on an ownership issue that we need to look into. The PMO, for instance, has had a big ownership component of delivering transport projects. That's not their core skill. So what we're wanting to achieve is to get a stronger or a total, basically, transport ownership of what we're delivering, so that the outcomes and the objectives of what we're doing aren't lost through that process. The third one we're looking at is the decision-making process, so that we get better rigour and scrutiny of option generation and option selection through the process in order to get really good quality documentation for Council's consideration.
Perhaps if we, Paul, are you able to speak to the funding of this, please?
Just taken in two parts. Firstly, the $3 million we're proposing that would be funded in the first instance through debt. We would quantify that debt separately in our ledger in terms of any recovery that would come back through NZTA, and we would then bring that back through the next annual plan process in terms of a debt retirement process that ensures that debt isn't stranded on balance sheet. So We've also just put the provision in that if we have any available funding this year through any surplus, that we will bring that back to council as an option to actually retire that sooner rather than later in terms of any funding available. In terms of the other part of the paper, in terms of the changes we're proposing to reallocate resourcing and in short fund that within existing budget, acknowledging that again there may be NZTA contribution both through any sort of capital project work that's undertaken or through the business unit charge that we get funding from NZTA for.
Okay, Martin and Alistair, any comments, any new comments before we go for questions?
No, but the diagrams on the slides may help if we can move to the next slide, just to understand the relationship which has been explained between UFD, the TSNP, and what each role is and how they relate to each other.
Is that on there somewhere? Can you? Oh, yeah. I think we need a new controller, slide controller. It's always, I think not a meeting goes by without it not working.
There we go. So there's just the two slides. If we think about UFD being the plan, the TSNP is the design, so that's the optioneering to understand what a preferred design is for particular places or parts of the network or corridors, and then the TSNP feeds into our funding and delivery decisions, which is the LTP and more generally the Regional Land Transport Plan. If we can move to the next slide, the last slide, please. And this is just from the paper itself, which again, UFD being the plan, so that's the direction on land use and transport and its outlook, and then the TSNP being that finer grained analysis at that part of the network corridor or place of what are those options and what's the best option to actually achieve the plan. And then feeding into LTP and our LTP processes, our infrastructure strategy and other planning processes. And I guess wrapping around all of this is the use of some common tools so we remain integrated with partners and plan processes.
Okay, so questions. Just a point that occurred to me, if UFD is the plan and TSNP is the design, should it be TSND? Because I think that gets very confusing to a lot of people, and not the least myself. So we've got a plan and a design, but we call the design a plan as well. Any thoughts there?
I think we need a new name. A few people are it's catching on the tongue, so yeah, new name is needed.
You know, we seem to have lots of plans. And my other question is, what sort of money can we expect from NZTA? And given that we've run into problems with business cases with them in the past, are we in some sort of an agreement that the business case we do is going to be acceptable and not simply rejected like has happened before?
Yeah, so we are working very closely with the agency. The conversation's live as we speak. They're looking to understand just how this doesn't duplicate past work, but as Christine suggested, just adds that tension between the processes. The typical subsidy or the standard rate FAR is 51% of total project costs, but there's still a conversation to have with them to confirm the availability of that funding.
Thank you. So I think we would all agree that transport is so important and something we need to certainly accelerate on what we're doing. I guess a small concern I have is often money goes into hui's rather than doi's. So by investing this money, for example, with Turret Road 15th Avenue, will that increase the time frame in which we see results on the ground for the people who are using these roads?
Well, this process will deliver us a preferred design for, that's the output of a single stage business case for that section of the wider network.
So whether the community sees something delivered on the ground depends on whether council decides to proceed with that through LTP processes and whether and to what extent you can get government investment by way of NZTA FAST subsidy or some other one-off investment. But at least we'll know the preferred option, high-level costs for that option, so then you can start those conversations.
Thank you. And just another question, if I may. What collaboration are we doing with Western Bay Council?
So the project is being run as a substream under the UFTI project, and so UFTI has the three councils, NZTA around the table, and we're also through that engaging with central government. So, and our intention is on specific corridors where other key stakeholders like the Port of Tauranga and Kiwi Rail, particularly in the Hull, Hewletts, Totara, we'll be working with them as well on those particular tranches of the project.
Yeah, I understand that UFTI is the overarching strategy or plan, and that this is our network system. But I see here it's not the 30-year period. I think 30 years is too short. When you look at how, for example, the development is racing up Pies Park Road from what it was 10, 12, 15 years ago, it's also heading up Oropi Road. It won't be long before, I believe, in the future it'll be Belk Road, and all that country is incredibly difficult to get any type of ring road in there, and I believe that we're not looking far enough ahead because we need a further southern ring road, which we're started, I understand, but the 30-year period is not long enough, I believe, and with the rate the city's expanding up those peninsulas, unless we're going to go across the river, which would have a few problems, and to Bethlehem, we've got some difficulties here, and I think we're focusing too much and down in the lower end of the city, and not looking ahead as to what we're going to need in the future.
Just to you, Christine, if I can, just to that paragraph 15. And Your Worship, if I might indicate, as Chair of the UFTID Committee, I would like to move this motion, if that's okay. Within the Turret Road 15th Ave Route K network, we are including in that the potential of connecting 15th Ave to Turret Road, because we haven't had a response from NZTA, but that's on the radar, isn't it? Yes, it's on the radar. So you passed two resolutions recently. One was around an emergency connection from 17th, and work is underway on that. So Alistair, as you know, has recently joined us. So he's picked that up as one of his projects. The second question you asked us around was the connection at 15th to K. We have started those conversations, but they're intricately linked with T&L. So it will be partly picked up. Once we scope these out, it will either go into Turret Road 15th Ave or it will go into that northwestern State Highway 2 29 connections, because 2 and 29 come together and then they come up either to 15 or to Elizabeth's. So once we define the geographic scope of these and which one of those two projects it most appropriately fits in, it will go into one of those scopes. And I think it's already been mentioned, but the ring road we're underway with is in that northwestern corridor kind of.
Yeah, so there is another project that's not on here, and the reason it's not on here is it's separately budgeted. So that's the Tauriko West sort of corridor from Tauriko in, and it deals with the matters that Councillor Molloy asked about, including the ring route. So you have previously passed a resolution to enable us to spend $300,000 of ratepayer funds on interim planning for the short-term solution, and that is part of a longer-term project which is looking out that long-term horizon, including up that entire corridor, based on the work that was done that identified that we could put significant growth in the Belk Road corridor together with the Kennedy Road area, Keenan. So that is a separate work stream that is funded in interim, and we're working with NZTA, and it's part of a near-term funding request that we'll be making as part of the housing supply that needs to come to the market. So that is addressed there, so we're not duplicating it in this piece of work.
Thank you. Firstly, welcome, Alistair. Really pleased to see that blue tag around your neck. It's good news for us. Just on page 479, we're talking about the project and the project brief, and we talk about the levers and the components, there's no mention of park and ride. So presumably, is it goes without saying that that will be considered as one of the components of the project and where it sits in this, or is it further afield, not in these tranches yet, or not in these corridors yet?
Yes, we will be considering park and ride as part of this. We'll be looking at all of the levers to help achieve the benefits we're looking to deliver.
Thank you. And second question, we've got the TSP, and the UFTI, the NLFT, the RLTP, the NOF, the POD, IDC, the NOP, the PMO. What's a PLT and what's an EEM? Because, I mean, of all of those, I don't get those two.
Sorry for all the acronyms. It doesn't help understanding the paper. So the PLT is the project leadership team for UFTI. That's the tier 2 managers primarily across the partnership. And the EEM is the Economic Evaluation Manual, which is essentially how we're guided to develop our benefit cost ratios.
Thank you. Can you just, for the benefit of the general public and even ourselves, just advise how you've determined the two different tranches? What was the basis of those?
So at this stage, we've tried to focus on those areas which we understand are under most pressure. So Hewlett's Road has been identified already through early UFTI work as a near-term project, and there's some short-term analysis underway on that right now to understand what can be done to optimise that. And there's an opportunity to then extend that into the medium to longer-term solution identification. The other was around the 15th Ave, Turret Road and Route K connection. Again, another key pressure point which we know the community is telling us to look at closely and understand that solution.
Yes, welcome, Alistair. Now, in terms of NZTA's FAR funding, with your inside knowledge, do you think this application or consideration of financial assistance from NZTA should get the tick off? It's just, if you can answer that. How do you feel about this?
I can't give you an absolute answer. The conversation's live. The indications at this stage are promising, but the agency is still very clearly advising us that they have funding availability challenges. But counter to that, we are a high growth area, there is pressure, and there is an understanding that we need to move closer towards identifying our solutions. So that's what we're working on now.
And second to that, do you think NZTA would find real value in this work stream?
Yes, they will, because it will have a whole of network scope. So it will include state highway plus local roads. So what it identifies will identify issues and possible solutions for state highway parts of the network as well as the local network.
And that was going to be something I was going to raise in discussion, that a lot of the roading we're talking about here is state highway. And so, I think there's real merit in really trying to get some leverage on this to get that NZTA funding, because it is quite essential, and it's certainly in the NZTA's camp. So if I was to move an amendment in Resolution D, resolves to allocate, subject to NZTA's commitment of FAR funding. So for no work to proceed until they provide certainty around funding, how would that upset the works in terms of your time frame and how we proceed with this? And you'd have some idea of when NZTA would be likely to make a decision, but how would that fit? So before I move it, I want an idea of, hey, would that actually be quite helpful in securing that funding if this council were to make it conditional on that funding?
I'll just ask perhaps Christine to comment. I mean, it's really a question for us, and we'd have to look at a number of things, including what tends to happen when amendments get moved. But anyway,
so it is a decision for you to make. What you've told us in the past is that you want this work addressed urgently. We have been raising these issues for some time, and the level of planning that's required, we're identifying that this piece of work needs to be done. It has been discussed at the UFTI Executive Review Group, where we've had senior representation from NZTA, so they understand why we think of it's important. They acknowledge that a significant portion of it relates to the state highway. The risk, if you say it's subject to, is that the time frame shifts, and the current time frame is going to be very tight for us to be able to get the work done to flow into the LTP and the RLTP. So basically, the Regional Land Transport Plan needs to be around July next year, and the LTP sort of a year from now, we need to be putting numbers into our systems. So the longer we leave it, the less information we'll have, and the less we're able to proceed and put those projects into those work streams. So it's just a risk trade-off for you around timing versus funding. You may get funding, but I don't know whether your decision to withhold funding would actually make a huge difference to NZTA's methodology for assessing whether or not they'll fund. They do that on the merits of the case that we put to them, and we're working hard to make that argument strong and robust, and working with them to understand what they're looking for. But it's absolutely a political call, not a staff one.
And for anyone who's listening, there is a question at the end of this, just to avoid interruption, unnecessary interruption. I think this is a cracking idea. The fact that we don't have this is an indictment on people that have sat in this place for years. The community's crying out for it. We need it, I've no doubt. And the sooner we start, the better. However, I'm a little bit concerned about the funding model, particularly in the light of a question not so long ago in this chamber about how we might fund, for instance, a small amount of effectively operational expenditure unbudgeted with regard to downtown Tauranga. And the model I was told at that time that wasn't acceptable now seems to be totally acceptable for $3 million, an order of magnitude 30 times greater, effectively, and of a size that should be the subject of, I would have thought, an LTPA. If we don't get the funding, this is 2% on the rates. If we treat it as debt, it reduces the rate impact, but it doesn't get rid of it. And the idea that we have to have F in the recommendations, I think, begs a question. So I would like a more detailed explanation, if I could have, of what other options there are. Is it possible to get some sort of indication of what other options there are for funding what I think needs to happen? But what's being proposed here and the assumptions that are being made, as I say, I was told not a week ago, were not, as I understand it, appropriate. I'm concerned about this. This is effectively 2% unbudgeted operational expenditure, which should, in theory, be funded by rates and is in effect 2% of next year's rates take. So what are the other options that were considered and why were they rejected?
Through the chair, a couple of things in there. One, in terms of the resolution at the moment provides for any surplus to come across this year, so that may reduce that money. We don't know obviously what that is at this point in time. However, with current interest rate markets heading where they're heading, there is likely that could provide some funding that will reduce that number. In terms of just a clarity around the actual debt retirement model going forward, what we propose to do, which is what we do on most of this type of loan funded expenditure, would be to do it over a 10-year period. So that would be effectively a $300,000 charge effectively on rates, plus the interest component, circa 4%, another 120, so you're at 420,000. So that's around about 0.25% of rates in terms of what the ongoing would be.
Supplementary debt funding of OPEX, where does that sit within our financial strategy?
So we provided in the financial strategy 1 or 2 LTPs ago that by council resolution we're allowed to do it if we perceived, if it was one, providing a long-term benefit to the community. Secondly, it was by council resolution to allow that to occur. Obviously, we want to ensure that there's no stranded liability that sits on balance sheet, which is why we also at the same time recommend that there's a debt retirement charge that goes with it.
Just so I'm clear, we could have used the same process, for instance, say funding, I don't know, some operational expenditure via Downtown Tauranga. We could use the same approach by resolution.
The difference with that was that the nature of that expenditure was quite immediate, and whereas this albeit providing a long-term potential, but it's just the type of expenditure and the quantum of expenditure were quite different.
Just to be clear, that's a judgment call, not a, yeah?
Yeah, that's
A
right.
political
The
decision.
quantum was significantly different though, and in this case, $3 million is obviously a much larger number, and therefore we put it over a 10-year period.
I think the other thing is, while this is sort of planning, and generally planning is more of an operational expenditure, because we are moving down to individual tranches on individual geographic areas and looking at options and design, it's moving towards where you would start to capitalise. It's not quite that far, but it's certainly of that more longer term nature rather than the more broader high level planning documents, which would generally be operational funding. So it's sort of a bit of a hybrid in the middle, heading towards that more type of expenditure that you would capitalise.
Questions, and then I'll see if Councillor Vordock wishes to move, I believe. So, any questions at this stage, Councillor? Okay. Councillor Baldock.
Thank you, Your Worship. Yes, I'll be happy to move A, B, C, D, E and G. And I might ask that the clock be started when I have a seconder, sorry. Sorry, well, where's the F? Yeah, F and G, there's no. Yeah, A to G. A to G. Oh, did I? Sorry.
We do have people waiting for the next item
Yes,
too. I think.
yes, well, that's why I want the clock going. I'm pleased to be able to move the endorsement of the TSNP. We come up with new acronyms all the time, don't we? And the additional budget of $3 million to resource the increased capacity and capability to deliver improvements in the management, design and delivery of the local network. Addressing the short-term, medium and long-term improvements to our transport network and TCC in the Western Bay of Plenty can seriously begin in earnest at last. 30 years, Councillor Molloy, may not seem far enough, but if you think back 30 years and what we didn't have, there wasn't much of a roading network here at all. And I believe we will see, as we begin this planning, we will see the needed improvements that the growing city will need. We've already talked about the UFTI August Draft Foundation Report, which is an important component of getting progress and moving forward with an established and agreed plan that can deliver improvements across all modes of transport in our city. This will form the basis of an agreement at some point in the near future, I hope, of a funding plan with the Bay of Plenty Regional Council, the Western Bay of Plenty Council, NZTA, Kiwi Rail, the Port of Tauranga, central government, and our ratepayers and road users, as it was in 2005, when we last had a plan of any significance to address our city's transport needs. Yesterday, I listened to some of the recordings of the inaugural council meeting, and I was reminded of the Mayor's very funny and clever speech on that occasion. It was one of his best speeches. My first words in this term of that council meeting was about my being passionate about our transport needs and dealing with congestion around our city. Then at my first meeting as a TCC representative on the Smart Growth Committee in this chamber, and I think I was sitting right about here, I spoke of the failure to complete the strategic roading network, the ring road, which we're all now familiar with, around our city that had been planned as part of the Access Partnership with NZTA. I wish Smart Growth recorded its meeting so I could reflect on exactly what I said then. In the past 3 years, progress has been painfully slow. Too much bureaucracy, one might say. And our community, understandably, may be losing its patience while waiting in traffic. Despite this, I strongly believe we have begun to make progress with UFTI, and since the amalgamating of our City Transformation Committee and the Transport Committee into the Urban Form and Transport Committee, we are now taking good steps in moving forward. This new funding approval and initiative to take the lead in developing the TSNP is an important step towards a more mobile city with greater transport choices. I want to acknowledge the Chief Executive's leadership and bold move to stand up at Smart Growth and declare that TCC would pursue the development of Taronga's system network plan. That was an interesting meeting for sure. I think we all stand with him in confirming that the challenges we face are 80% Taronga City Councils, and therefore we need to provide strong leadership on 80% of the solutions, while continuing to stress the importance of collaboration across the sub-region that enables us to make progress together. We cannot afford to miss the opportunity to build on the Taronga transport work already done over several years, and we must use that as a foundation to investigate all possible solutions through the TSNP work that can give our city a chance of avoiding the crippling congestion Auckland experiences. It will involve all modes of transport choices. No single mode can solve all the challenges, and the government policy has made it clear we need to make progress on modal shift. We need to continue to strike a balance between investment in the road network, improving public transport system, and the development of the citywide cycle network without allowing any particular ideology to dominate and hold us back. A Courier research poll conducted in June this year asked 700 respondents the following question: Taronga is experiencing greater traffic congestion, with government and council resources limited. On a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is the lowest priority and 5 is the highest priority, where would you want council to focus investment? Building roads and improving intersections, or better public transport, or cycleways? The results revealed that roads and intersections scored 4.3, public transport 3.4, and cycleways 2.8. It's a pretty good spread, actually. In fact, the fact that roads and intersections came out on top would be no surprise. In fact, you'd think it might have even been 5. But I think the community have understood that they need to change behaviour and are supportive of investment on a broader front. This is contrary to what you might expect when the oft-repeated statistic that we are such a car-dependent city. This poll gives evidence of public support for the proposal and budget allocation in the motion before us. Our community wants, to coin Councillor Stewart's phrase, our community wants Dewey, not more Huey, and that has a cost attached to it. We already invested this term in 100 million in cycleways in the LTP. If you compare that with that spread, we would be ready to commit somewhere around about 150, 108 million of ratepayer funding for that potentially, although that was reliant upon the NZTA subsidy at that time. In closing, I think it's worth mentioning the other two items we've already passed in this meeting, the UFTI Draft Foundation, as I said, and also the work that Accessible Properties will be doing, because we cannot solve our transport issues without the work also that's covered under our Taronga Urban Strategy and the intensification work, particularly through the spatial plan for the Te Papa Peninsula. And it is good news to say that soon we'll be notifying plan changes that will support greater density of housing and a range of housing typologies. There has been good work going on during this term. These are all good news stories that we can derive some satisfaction from in getting to this stage at the final meeting of this council. Not everything has been good news in the last 3 years, but despite all that, some very good work has been steadily progressing, much of which is a tribute to the hard work and determination of the staff at TCC. And I can only hope that the public will be aware of these developments and that put the city in a good place to continue moving forward with a new council after the elections. This might, of course, be my valedictory speech. We will know in a month's time. but there will be a lot that the new council has to come to terms with in order to keep moving forward in this great city we are privileged to live in. Thank you very much.
Yes, there will be a lot of valedictory speeches. Is that what you were? No, that was him. Okay, Councillor Clout.
Thank you very much. Yeah, look, clearly, we aren't getting out of UFTI what we thought we were going to when we first signed up for it. And so I think it's really important, and I'm very pleased that TCC is stepping up to the plate, and we get on and plan and design and cost out some of these big projects which will help unlock our traffic and congestion. And it has been mentioned it will be multimodal. We can't just continue to rely on the private motor vehicle. We are keeping NZTA in the loop, and I'll be very surprised, and in fact I'll be very annoyed if they do not come to the party with their funding assistance rate on these projects. So I'm very happy to support this, and I think it's something we just have to get on and do.
Yeah, I would ask that the motion be put in parts, Your Worship. Clock's on. Oh, that's quick. Thank you. Progress has been slow, I think, this triennium because there have been too many distractions. The community wanted to focus on transport, but some of my colleagues were keen to talk about other things that the community hadn't said were a focus. I think the words of Christine Jones should resonate in this room permanently. When asked to comment on questions around on the ground, she made the extraordinarily accurate observation that it depends on funding decisions. This council and many others have habits of producing plans and not funding them. Councillor Baldock made reference to the Joint Officials Group paper of 2005, where having identified what costs were required for the roading network, the great and glorious leaders of the Western Bay sub-region decided, no, we will do it cheaper, came up with some Mickey Mouse financing plan, which fell over at the first instance, and that's one of the reasons we have the shambles today. You can make all the plans you like, you can have all the visions possible, but until you make a decision to fund them and prioritise that funding for this community, you will deliver nothing. You may get headlines by citing motions with regard to $100 million cycleway investments, but the truth is we've invested nothing like that. Nothing like that. Smart growth failed. Again, Christine Jones was tasked with identifying what was happening there and came back with one of the most honest reports I've seen in my time in Tauranga. I've been here 15 or 16 years, and identified that there was no plan. The move by the chief executive, with the support, I'm sure, of his general management team, to create a proper plan is overdue and welcomed by me. But I find it hard to believe that Councillor Baldock thinks he's giving a valedictory when interspersed frequently in his speech he has his campaign slogan moving forward. Good to hear. The fight's still there. I support the motion, but I do not support the way it is proposed to be funded. I would ask that it be put in parts. I will repeat, yet again, we're entering into planning. Without funding, we will deliver nothing. And grabbing headlines by making promises of funding conditional upon far rates from an organisation that's practice at the moment is not to listen to communities, look at the Bay Underpass situation, is highly risky. We should acknowledge the $3 million of debt-funded OPEX, write it to our accounts, and then talk later about how we pay that. But to make an assumption that we will use I think Councillor Clout, in a moment of rare clarity, called a debt enablement levy to fund it, is highly unlikely to be the case. Thank you.
Speakers? Councillor Kurak.
I definitely do support it. We need to do this work. In terms of the funding, I am reasonably comfortable with progressing as recommended, because it's really the foundation of a big bunch of projects, and that gives me comfort to say, in a way, it could be capitalised to provide that long-term benefit and therefore support the proposed funding of it. It's something, that I would have difficulty with in terms of rate funding the community of today for something that's going to provide benefit for a very long term. So that's what gives me comfort. So I look forward to the work. I'm sure NZTA will come to the party. I think this is really, it's up its alley in terms of what it, the direction it's heading, and we will receive the FAR rate funding for this bit of work.
Speakers? Councillor Stewart.
Thank you. I won't do a political broadcast, but I would agree with Councillor Robson's comments that you can do all the planning, but unless you've got the funding there to execute the projects, then it's just hui instead of doing. So I hope the next council will promote transport as being, I believe, the number one issue for the council going forward.
Well, from my point of view, we've asked the Chief Executive many times over the last year whether there is sufficient funding being allocated to this whole transport problem, and usually he's answered yes. But I think this particular occasion, the management team are coming to us and saying we need more. I'm comforted by the fact that TSNP is in fact the design, so it's actually getting down to do something. It's not just going to be talking. Transport is the number one issue in this community, and as already been mentioned by Councillor Robson, this is probably long overdue. I think this is us taking our future into our own hands, and we are demonstrating leadership by doing this. I expect NZTA to come to the party because much of this, most of it, relates to state highways, and it's important to get those intersections of those state highways and local roads right. So it simply will not be good enough for them to stand to the side or obfuscate or delay things. The roads within 5 to 10 kilometres of the port, and I think many of us think, are some of the most important strategic roading and rail links in the whole country. The investment is absolutely necessary and required now. I think we should keep some sort of a ledger and ultimately expect NZTA to come to the party. Speaking of which, because of the delays over replies to the Bayfair underpass concerns, we're going to arrange our own Bayfair underpass meeting and invite NZTA to that. So I'll make that statement now, and we will be finding a day in or an evening in the not too distant future. The funding, of course, is always a concern, but I think in this particular case, we've got to look at every possible way of doing that, because it is, I believe, the community's number one priority. And for us to dilly-dally about that, nothing is going to actually happen. So there's my little speech. Any other speakers? Okay, so a right of reply, Councillor Baldock.
Yeah, I'll try and be brief, but Councillor Robson just keeps delivering me so many things that I can reply to.
Yeah, well, try not to be tempted.
It is just very tempting. If I am lucky to be returned in the next triennium, I might miss him on 1 or 2 days of the next 3 years. We first of all have to plan. Fundamentally, you have to have a plan before you can get funding. And that was the case in 2005. Councillor Robson raised that. There was a lot of work went into the whole network plan. The funding did provide for a new Cross Harbour Bridge, the widening of Hewlett's Road, the flyover at Hewlett's Monganui. All of the work that went on previous to that was already done by the previous council with Takitimu Drive and so on. The thing that fell over was that a political decision was made to take the tolling off the new bridge and left a big hole in the funding. That can happen at any time, but we must carry on and get the plan done, and then we're going to have some very serious conversations. You might remember we had that already with the regional council, who are sitting on a considerable resource in this region, and their response was, we need to first of all have a plan. So let's get the plan. Let's examine everything that needs to be addressed. It will cover things like grade separating our railway corridors, where they impact with roading, and it will be a big bill. Some of us have talked about the 4 billion that will be needed. That will be the next phase, and the government will have to be part of that. But until we have the plan, it is not going to go anywhere, and this funding is needed to get that plan completed.
Okay, so I will put it in parts, but for the sake of doing every single part, I'll just get an indication from Councillor Robson. F is the particular part you would like to, yeah. So you would consider the others being put together. Is there anybody else that would like a separate, anything other than F put separately? Okay, so I will put A to E and G, and then we'll come back for F. So this is A to E and G. Oh, sorry, Max. Oh, you can't really hear. Okay, we will do that. Because we just had the right to reply, Max. I'm not sure if you're trying to speak or if that's just feedback. Okay.
Well done, everybody.
Thank you. Great. Okay, so this is A to E and G. All in favour say aye. Aye. Against? So that's carried. And this is F. So all in favour, raise your hands. So it's myself, Councillor Granger, Councillor Kurak, Clout, Brown, Baldock, Malloy and Stewart. And Councillor Mason, is your hand up? Yep, okay. And against, Councillors Morris and Robson. So that's carried. Thanks very much, everybody. Thank you. The Marine Precinct is the topic we'll go back to now. Well, just a 5-minute one because the people here are waiting for it. So, and we will be breaking about 12. So, just a 5-minute stop for whatever. Adjourn for 5 minutes. Okay, DC 279, review of the Marine Precinct Part 2. Okay, so who's going to speak to that? Paul. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair. DC 279 is the Part 2 of the Marine Precinct report undertaken by Max Pedersen. Back in July, we presented Part 1. Part 1 was focused on how Council has delivered on its undertakings. Part 2 is in terms of a review of the current operations of the Marine Precinct. The purpose of separating the reports was that as Mr. Pedersen worked through some of the operational issues, particularly in Part 2, were beyond his expertise, and we paused at the time to actually get someone in to actually look at that. Now, it's fair to say that there's been a number of issues raised in terms of the independence of that party that's actually assisted within that. The conflict of interest was acknowledged to us in the first instance in terms of a previous contractual relationship between the current contractor and Mr. Warren, but no current relationship does exist that we are aware of, but that was declared. It's fair to say that it's proven very difficult, and I know Mr. Pedersen had quite difficulty in finding someone that actually did have a level of independence and the expertise within New Zealand to actually undertake the review, which was part of the problem within there. In terms of the outcomes of the review, however, this report covers both another 7 recommendations coming out of that report, plus it updates in terms of the previous recommendations. I think it's fair to say that the most noticeable action that's been taken to date has been the establishment of the Marine Precinct Advisory Group. It had its first meeting 3 weeks ago. It's got another one tomorrow. That is made up of the 4 major businesses that actually use the precinct, plus myself, and that is working through the issues, and will continue to work through the issues that that arise at the precinct, including on tomorrow night's agenda, is to go through this report in a bit more detail, and including further conversation around that conflict and how it may have actually had any impact on the report. So I'll just pause to take any questions on the content at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Paul, I'm having trouble hearing you clearly with the microphone, but if I picked up on what you were saying about a conflict of interest, was it to do with Mr. Warren's report, and who commissioned him to do that report?
Through the chair, it was commissioned through Max Pedersen in consultation with us, and in case it didn't come through clearly in terms of that, we did know that there had been a previous relationship in existence, and one of the biggest issues that we had was actually, Mr. Pedersen had, was finding someone that actually had that independence, and that Mr. Warren did present a 17-point process which we can work through at the advisory group in terms of how he actually stepped through the report.
Thank you. Paul, there are some recommendations in both from Mr. Warren and in Max's report, but none of them have timeframes around them. So is that something the advisory group's going to address? How soon are we going to start to see some of these recommendations implemented?
And what I would acknowledge that I think that the report, in some ways, there are a lot of issues existing down there that are outside the report that we're aware of as well, and that's coming up through the advisory group as well. So we want to work through in terms of a forward look, in terms of actually how we can work through all of the issues effectively that are going down there, and work that process through. So it won't just be confined to the content of the report. It gives us some information within there, but there's also a number of other issues that are arising as well that we're working through with that group.
So supplementary, then how do you plan, or how will the group plan to prioritise or address? Will it be the advisory group that will determine what are the most pressing issues that need to be sorted out and the priorities of those changes?
That's absolutely correct. obviously advisory group is there when things can't be resolved actually at the precinct itself. So first instance is it's resolved. Second, if it doesn't, it comes up to the advisory group. Not everything can be resolved immediately, but what ideally, and I don't want to talk on behalf of the advisory group, but ideally we develop a work program forward that actually looks at actually addressing those issues.
So I've got Councillor Robson, Stewart, Mason and Kurak. You have to remember the order.
Yeah, two questions, if I may, through you, Your Worship, to Paul Davidson. Did Mr. Warren speak to all the stakeholders? My understanding is he didn't. A number of key stakeholders were not questioned by Mr. Warren. And I understand that a number of comments that they've made in the course of the discussions around the Marine Precinct haven't been included in the report. Can we have a comment on that, please? So why did Mr. Warren not speak to a number of what I believe to be key stakeholders? And why is it that comments made by those key stakeholders are not appearing in this report?
Through the chair, so Mr. Warren, you're correct, Mr. Warren didn't talk to all stakeholders. He worked with Mr. Pedersen in terms of actually the brief that he was given, which was in terms of the operations within the precinct itself. I can't comment. There is obviously a more detailed report that Mr. Warren has produced, very operational in nature, getting right down into the detail which isn't included in here, purely because it was advisory to Mr. Pedersen's report for him to make a conclusion on.
Is there any issue with us seeing Mr. Warren's report?
Just the one thing I just need to confirm, just because it actually impacts on some of the staff that are actually employed by Wardale, as to whether we can, we may need to redact some information in there, depending on the information, but depending on the contractor's release of that.
Thank you. Through the chair to Paul, is it intended that the Marine Precinct Advisory Group will then report back to Council through Projects and Monitoring or such like committee?
Certainly it will form part of the overall marine reporting as part of an activity report that comes back through that. And in the terms of reference that still need to be finalised by the group, but there is the provision for reporting through to Council.
Councillor Mason, if you'd like to speak now.
Your Worship. Paul, could you tell us, just remind us about the financial performance currently? Is it performing to expectations? Thank you.
So in terms of financial performance against budget, the precinct actually is exceeding its target in the first year of operations, but I would say that in saying that, it was a little bit unknown what that, the exact nature of that. So against the business case, it is actually performing well. However, I think what the report acknowledges is that there are a number of stakeholders that exist at the precinct that are actually beyond the pure financial performance, and that's what we want to actually ensure that that we address going forward.
Regarding the advisory group and its monitoring job, it will have to interface with the Wardale operation in terms of the contract requirements. Is there any performance criteria within the Wardale contract that could be used when it gets a bit difficult? I'm just trying to establish in my mind the value in that sort of feedback loop, because just to check out, is there performance criteria in the contract that could be used to provide extra leverage into achieving better outcomes?
Through the chair, there are performance criteria in the contract that obviously I can't go into any detail in an open meeting, but I think that the issues that are arising are actually need to be managed within the bounds of the contract. But ultimately, we need to just work together to actually, with all of the stakeholders, to actually take the precinct forward. the contract won't, it won't prevent that from happening, but won't, it's a level of detail that won't be the only mechanism that we use to actually make that happen.
Paul, but possibly we need the Chief Executive to respond. I mean, this issue of Mr. Warren's previous relationship is going to hang over this thing like a cloud, and I'm surprised no one has yet already made comparisons to another conflict, that had serious implications. So unless we have more information about the previous relationship and can actually satisfy ourselves that this doesn't affect his professional opinion in this report, we're sort of just going to have people throwing this out and saying, well, there's bias and so on going on. Can we get beyond this?
So, in terms of the previous relationship, I understand at Panuku, Mr. Warren was a general manager there, and Wardale Limited was under contract similar to the situation that exists here. He also provided advice on the procurement of the travel lift, and from what I understand has been on overseas trips as part of the marine industry. That's what I know at this point.
So, can we respond?
Yeah, through the chair. Look, this is just one aspect of a range of issues that we've looked at down there, and I don't know that any particular issue is critical enough to, if you like, change the way the current operation is happening. I think collectively, there's a very strong message that there are issues down there in terms of relationships and arguably performance. So collectively, this is just one piece of a number of, I guess, issues that we need to address. Paul, have you spoken about the way that the contract is currently being managed? But I guess we are looking at the way the contract has been managed up until now and are proposing to make some changes in the very, very short term that will change that.
Through the chair, just in terms of those changes, we've actually contracted someone that started this week working down at the Marine Precinct, which is fundamentally around contract management and stakeholder management, working with stakeholders to actually improve those relationships there. As the Chief Executive referred to, that's a short-term measure until we get any sort of longer-term change in place. But we absolutely recognise that there are issues down there. We don't really, quite frankly, we don't need the report to know that there are issues down there, and we want to keep working on actually resolving those going forward.
But some of the really big issues are the ones which have led to 3 incidents, as mentioned. And when Mr. Warren says, that these things are I've yet to know of a boatyard that has not had some problems like this, that's where we kind of lose the credibility of his comments unless we can clarify this relationship, because that's a serious issue, and it impacts on the reputation going out around the nation. So we've got to kind of get to that one if we can.
But it also goes back to the integrity of the professional and him giving his professional advice. So I don't know that necessarily we should go out and commission another report. Arguably, we could do some work on Mr. Warren and his credentials as to his professional ability and integrity, because essentially as a professional he's provided us some advice which ultimately will be enduring.
Would you accept that there's a counter argument that the fact that he has done work for Panuku over these kind of situations, that actually it does strengthen the fight?
Well, look, I think the issue with this was that it was very difficult to find someone in the industry that Mr. Wardale hasn't worked with or alongside or in opposition to. And I think this was the reason why this report has taken so long, and so we made a calculated decision based on all the information we had, and this is where we've landed.
I just before we go on to the next question, it's sort of a question, but sort of not either. I think probably the main thing is going forward what we do and to improve the situation there. I don't know about working boatyards. I don't know if the current marina area is a working boatyard, but recently a gentleman retired from there who's been lifting boats there for 30-something years and never dropped one. But I just mentioned that as a comment in answer to some of those questions. Never dropped one. Councillor Robson, Granger and Curag.
Yeah, I have some minor questions, just to clarify a few things if I may, but I would make the observation that a bit like the way councillors haven't read the Colgan report and it makes it difficult to genuinely understand things, if we don't get to see Warren's report again, the councillors, the governance of this council are flying to a large extent blind. And I appreciate the repeated use of staff and commercial confidential and whatever, but there comes a point where that wears a little thin. My understanding is that Mr. Warren didn't speak to any stakeholders down there. Could we get clarification on that before we get to see the report, please? Is that possible to get clarification on who he spoke to?
Have that clarified.
Thank you. And the second thing, and this is to clarify, if you like, your words, Paul, when the question was asked, and I can't remember which councillor asked it, with regard to the advisory group, the response was they could report through to council. I'm just wondering whether there's any reason why they can't report directly to council. Would that cause a problem in some way? I'd be, what I'm hearing at the moment, if you like, is muffled when it comes through the machine, as I affectionately call it, the machine. What I hear is muffled, but when I get the words direct, it's very, very clear, and it sounds just different in terms of tone and impact, and I just wondering if there's any reason why that advisory group couldn't report directly. I suppose in the same way that, I don't know, downtown Tauranga have no problem coming here and making comments directly on the performance of council and the mayor and whatever else. Is there any reason why that group couldn't report directly?
Through the chair, obviously it's a council decision in terms of the future of how that reports, but the key focus that we're really trying to actually work through is with that advisory group and with some stronger contractual management in place to actually try and eliminate and actually work forward these issues without the need for it to escalate.
Supplementary, will the cost of the contract that we've now had to put in place, will that be charged against effectively the activity? We have a habit in council of not charging some of the, how can one put it, the associated costs of various activities, projects, initiatives, whatever, to those cost centres. It makes their profitability look good, but of course the burden is always picked up by, that's right, the ratepayer.
Yes, it will. It's a cost of the activity, so it will be charged to the activity.
Look, supplementary to what Councillor Baldock mentioned before as regards to Mr. Warren and some other similar sort of issues happening in other yards throughout New Zealand, my major concern is he doesn't seem to mention, though, the same number of issues in the same time. And that point that our mayor mentioned before, that some people have been in the job a long, long time and nothing has happened at all. So as regards to the three that had happened in that time, has he given any other examples throughout New Zealand of the same thing, the same time?
Chair, difficult question to answer. No, he hasn't. In terms of what that might look like, the comments are effectively just reflected what he said in the report, in the conclusion, in terms of that it is an operational boatyard and that incidents, can and do occur.
Paul, just thinking of some of the other contracts of service that this council has, our monitoring job to look at those the providers of the services. I'm thinking Priority One, CCOs, Chamber of Commerce, etc., and they have contracts. So looking at this advisory group, who will be basically doing sort of a bit of our role in terms of monitoring the operation there, will it have access to the contract? I mean, there might be commercially sensitive stuff like the amount, but generally the rest of the contract, will that advisory group be given a copy so it knows what to measure against?
Not in terms of the contract, but we can work through in terms of what would be, mutually agreeable performance criteria. One of the suggestions in Mr. Pedersen's report is that we, that we conduct some surveys in terms of actually how the precinct's going. Now, I don't think there's a lot of value in that at the moment because we know what it is. But it is ongoing monitoring that we do need to put in place to ensure that we're actually, monitoring that over a period of time. So we certainly can look at that.
That's great. If I can stress the need, I think, for some of that performance criteria to actually go to the advisory group, I think it's quite important because it's formalised.
Thank you. This is quite an operational question. I'm not sure if you'll be able to answer it, Paul. To what extent is the, shall we say, the tidal flow impacting on the use and the safety of the travel lift?
Correct. I will struggle to answer that question. The experts in the back might be better to answer that than me, to be honest. There is a strong tidal flow down there. One of the issues that we've got in terms of working through the wharf development that occurs down there is to making sure that everything actually fits and is able to actually operate within that tidal environment effectively within there. So it would be a lot trickier if there was no tide. A lot simpler if there was no tide, yeah.
Do we wait for someone else to make a comment, or because I think it's quite a significant impact, and if that's the case, then it sort of makes me wonder, right back at the very early planning stages, whether or not this was taken into account sufficiently.
Would have thought it would be. It was known for many millions of years. There's probably been tides coming in and out of the Tauranga Harbour. Well, some would say less. Councillor Baldock.
Just two questions. One is to you, Mayor Brownless, and the other to staff. The man you mentioned earlier who's never dropped one, is he operating a 350-tonne travel lift, or is it something considerably smaller?
Smaller than that would be, I guess, it'd be around 100. I don't really know the exact details, but the principles are the same, and has obviously had experience, and it's just as people can drop these sorts of things.
I'm not passing judgment on that. I'm just trying to clarify that.
Yeah, but it's not a 400 or 350 tonne.
And how many 350 tonne travel lifts are there in the country that we can sort of compare with?
Well,
one other.
It's the regional development funds paid for that one. We need to consider a resolution. I'm not sure if there's any member wishes to entertain. Councillor Clout, do you want to try? Okay, so it's receiving it and noting the recommendations, but there probably needs to be more happen. What will the next steps be?
Well, perhaps I think we can report progress back through the Projects and Services Committee on this. So.
Just a point of information, point of clarification. Will there be minutes taken of the advisory group meeting tomorrow?
Yes. There are minutes. There are minutes of the first meeting and
In which case, I have an amendment to the recommendation. Has it been moved and seconded by someone? No. If it has a mover and a seconder, then I'll then move an amendment.
You can second, because it hasn't been seconded yet. Then you can add in.
Yeah, I would, if the person proposing moving is happy for me to move an amended motion, I would move that recommendation as written, plus a D, that the minutes of the advisory group, Marine Precinct Advisory Group meeting of Wednesday tomorrow, are circulated to elected members. I mean, I would like that to be the case, but I would have liked that to be the case, for instance, for the Technical Advisory Group for the Heart of the City project, but I know some members were heavily against that on the grounds that that would suppress their ability to speak freely.
Okay, so we will just, we will get to the nub of it. So it's the minutes of the advisory group meetings are to be circulated to EMs, and that would cover all of them rather than just the one on tomorrow. Well, it would seem to be sensible. And I think especially while we're in the process of trying to get it right. Okay, and you're happy to second that, Councillor Clout? So we'll just swap the order. So would you like to speak to that, Councillor?
Yeah, look, it's been made clear to us by staff we're in the middle of a process here. This is a significant investment by Tauranga City Council. I think it was a good idea in principle. I think much of the execution has been good. There are external stakeholders of some significance here. Our friends at Regional Council, for instance, have a close interest in this. I believe we as councillors should take a close interest in this. These reports help. Staff will be coming back to us, I'm sure, with additional information as it becomes available. And I think it behoves us to get some sort of direct line to the key stakeholders, just to make sure that, as I say, we're getting things clearly. So I commend the motion.
Thank you, and appreciation to Max Peterson for a thorough but also concise report, as he is usually, that's the manner of his work. The 7 recommendations there, I think, are all very self-explanatory and make good sense. And I mean, clearly, you know, there are some issues down there, but overall, I believe the Marine Precinct has achieved some or most of its goals, and I believe as we continue to refine processes down there, that will only improve over time. Thank you.
Thank you. Firstly, thank you to Marty for commissioning the report. We heard lots of individual frustrations, so to do this report just gave more clarity to what was happening, and I think the advisory group is an excellent idea. And I do feel for the people down there, because they've had lots of frustrations, they've had lots of delays in getting their titles through, and I'm sure there's been lots of costs associated with that. So I just want to highlight the fact that the people down there have had to go through a lot of stress, and that, thank goodness, something more positive is happening going forward.
Yeah, I think the advisory group is a great idea, and I hope it's going to help bring about a joint ownership of the project down there, because that, I think, is really important. There's been lots of frustrations. Some of them, the titles, which of course have nothing much to do with Phil Waddell, in that those are regulatory matters, though communications have never been all that great, and that has led to unrealistic expectations, or expectations that are understandable, but then regulatory have to make those decisions. But I hope we don't see a situation that's developed a little bit in Main Street, where, you know, people complain about things forever and then don't realise that actually they're hurting their own businesses by doing so. That this Marine Precinct has to be successful, and that means that everybody benefits from working together and trying to work through these, and I think the advisory group is the right approach for that to happen.
I agree there'll be real value in this coming from the advisory group. There are wrinkles to iron out, and I'm sure it can be achieved, and look forward to hearing about the smooth sailing into the future.
Finished on a pun. Thank you to Max and also the Chief Executive for instigating this review. It's been a worthwhile review. We have got recommendations, which is always good to have something to work towards, but I am concerned there are no timelines or a program of work yet to ensure that those recommendations are addressed but it looks like we've already started that with the stronger contractual management that the Chief Executive talked about. MPAG, we've got another acronym to add to the list for the new council. Let's let MPAG do their thing, which will include more transparency to the council about what's happening in the precinct and report back to PSOC in the new triennium.
Okay, right of reply. Councillor Robinson? Right of reply.
Enough said, I think.
So I'll put that, all in favour say aye. Aye. Against? So that's carried. Thank you very much. Now, I just want to ask, so that we don't waste any time, have you had a chance to look at the minutes? Do you want a couple of minutes, a few minutes to look at the minutes? So 5 minutes to do that, and then we'll put them through, and then we'll break after that. So don't go away. We'll just adjourn for a short time. Okay, we're going to resume the meeting, and we've got 4 sets of minutes. Council on the 20th, 27th of August, 6th and 10th of September. So I'll take any points for Councillor Brown.
So referring to the minutes of the 6th of September, in the second set after we resumed, at the bottom of page 15 of these minutes here, we've got just an error on DC 281 around where the DC 281 was left to lie on the table, just with the recording of the majority versus those who supported for and against. That just needs to be tidied up and then put into the minutes in the correct version of the events.
Can be done from the recording of the meeting?
Yes.
Happy with that? Okay, so that's that. Any other points in relation to any of the minutes? Councillor Stewart?
It refers to a confidential item, but what I'm saying isn't confidential, so if I could just say with regards to the community facilities paper that I move that the appendix comes into the open, so that's not recorded in the minutes.
It was discussed, and then when we moved into confidential, it wasn't moved, but it was generally agreed that that should happen. So I think there was just an oversight, given it was rather late at night when you finished. So DC 207, Appendix A, which was Tauranga Community Facilities Needs Analysis. My understanding was that was to move into open, but there is, and so we need a resolution in the minutes to that effect.
It could be corrected in the minutes at the appropriate time. Thank you.
Can that resolution be done in the open or in confidential?
Need a mover now for it, or will it be?
If you prepare to move that, Councillor?
I can move.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
And seconded. Any discussion on that? I think it was agreed anyway. So I'll put that all in favour, say aye. Against, so that's carried. And now going to the minutes as a whole, so approving the minutes with the subject to the alterations being suggested by Councillor Brown, moved by Councillor Robson, seconded by Councillor Baldock. Any discussion? Okay, so all in favour say aye. Aye. Against? So that's carried. So we have one item left now, is that correct, in the open section, and that is the matter of Mission Street. So we'll be addressing that at 1 o'clock, and then we only have the confidential section to go after that. So we'll adjourn the meeting till 1 o'clock. Thank you.